Biden will announce the Supreme Court reforms next week. What to know about J.D. Vance? The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is trying to crack down on so-called whistleblowers who are exposing gender medicine. A 134-year-old American furniture chain is closing down all 553 stores. This is Dr. David D. Schein, and welcome to a special episode of Saving America with our weekly update. Here's some of the top stories that we're covering. The U.S. national debt hits $35 trillion. This is not a one-party problem. I've heard a pundit recently comment that the service on the national debt next year will exceed the amount that we put into national defense. Part of my concern is I don't hear either political party campaigning on a basis of controlling the national debt. I'm very concerned about it, not just for our children and our children's children, but for the current generation. And remember, this is on top of Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security running out of money. We have some serious financial situations going on, and America's politicians are not dealing with it. China's expanding Arctic ambitions challenge the U.S. and NATO. This is a mega story for the foreseeable future. Xi is an ambitious fool. However, as they say, never take fools lightly. The CCP is doing its best to ruin the economy of mainland China. Showing these displays of force are designed to keep the average person in China focused on something other than the failing economy and the incredible demographic results of the one-child policy. We know that China wants a nuclear sub in the Arctic. If USA and NATO allow this, this could portend a significant change in the balance of power, a change nobody in the free world can allow. The United States needs to exercise its territorial jurisdiction and make sure that doesn't happen. Speaking of the free world being challenged, U.S. and Canadian fighter jets had to scramble Russian and Chinese nuclear bomb-capable bombers near the U.S. Arctic area. This is sovereign U.S. land. Frankly, I would like to see a stronger response by the U.S. and its allies. How about forcing these enemy planes to land and arresting their crews? These countries would not hesitate to do that if a U.S. plane crew traveled into their national waters or national airspace. It is time to get tough, which is difficult to say when you've got a clown like Biden in the White House. Speaking of clowns, Blinken, our alleged Secretary of State, says Iran is only a few weeks away from having a nuclear bomb. As usual with the incompetent Biden administration, they have done nothing to stop the Iranians. Massive sanctions need to be placed on Iran until it is broke. This backwards country needs a good slapdown. The U.S. tolerates endless public statements about destroying the U.S. and Israel by Iran's deranged leaders. It is time to get tough in response. A very sad story. An Iranian-made rocket launched by Hezbollah killed 12 children playing soccer in northern Israel. 29 other people were hospitalized. The children killed were part of the Druze people. This is a unique sect in that they are Arabs who are not Muslims. So the terrorists now claim that they were trying to hit an Israeli military base. Of course, I find it offensive that people are protesting against Israel when it was the one attacked on October 7th. Over 100 hostages may still be held in horrendous conditions in Gaza. Israel has done all it can to defend itself and not hurt Gazan civilians. So it's okay for the terrorists to target non-combatants, but not Israel. A ridiculous position. While Netanyahu was speaking to Congress, a bunch of violent demonstrators took down 3 American flags, burned them, put up terrorist flags, and caused all sorts of mayhem. Now, this takes resources, folks. You may not realize it, but you don't suddenly have a paper mache a big figure of Netanyahu to burn if you don't have the resources to start with. I suspect that these gullible fools are being funded by Iran in some fashion. And I believe that is against federal law, but I don't know that the Biden administration is doing anything about it. Now, there were only 29 police officers available to work on this. Why was the National Guard not called out? This should have been all hands on deck. Biden will announce the Supreme Court reforms next week. Folks, I just find this story so rich when this fool has been on the public dole for 50 years and he wants limits for SCOTUS, but he hasn't brought up limits for Congress or ethical rules for Congress. I have previously expressed my support for ethics rules for SCOTUS. Same rules should apply across the U.S. government. It's time to get on board, clean up the act. Let's put term limits in for everybody. Let's get rid of lifetime pensions. And let's put in some hardcore ethics rules. And if you're only serving in Congress for a few years, it's not hard to comply with those ethics rules, like not having stock that you know about in particular companies and things like that. Hey, Nancy Pelosi, pay attention. On term limits, the general idea, the reason that federal judges serve for life was to prevent them from being biased so that they would not be shopping for their next job, and also that they would not say, well, gee, if my term ends, people might get even with me because I voted a certain way. This was designed to be truly independent. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court has been somewhat compromised since the administration of FDR in the 1930s and early 1940s. And as we all know, they tried to pack the court. There's been some rumors about the Dems wanting to pack the court. I don't see that happening before the end of the year. If Kamala Harris was to, by some freak of nature or voting cheating, was to be elected, I think that they could go after the Supreme Court and either pack the court or do something else that's stupid. The oddity of this is that the Dems are simply playing politics. In a recent survey, only 20% of the decisions of the current term of SCOTUS could be considered political. And in fact, many of the decisions were unanimous. So as we say, be careful what you wish for. All of the slopstream media seems to want to talk about regarding J.D. Vance is to repeat his recent comment about women who do not want to have children. I do not share his opinion on that, but there's a lot more to this candidate. Vance served in the Marine Corps from 2003 to 2007. He was deployed to Iraq for 6 months during that period. After graduating from Ohio State University in 2009 and Yale Law School in 2013, he worked at a venture capital firm briefly. He then started his own venture capital firm. This is a bright, ambitious person. He became somewhat famous when his book, Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of family and culture in crisis, was published in 2016. It was later made into a movie. I have not read the book. I've not seen the movie, but I understand it details the struggles he faced growing up with poverty, an addicted mother. His grandmother, who was deeply religious, raised him and imbued him with certain key principles. He became a senator in Ohio by defeating an incumbent Democrat in 2022. I would say his opinions are conservative, moderate. This is not your run-of-the-mill, all right side politics are right. Like me, he emphasizes that America needs to focus on the threat from communist China and North Korea. He is a man of strong faith. He has just turned 40, so a young candidate these days, and he and his wife have 3 young children. But he expresses his religious beliefs openly, and I believe that's a positive in a world that needs to have some ethical guidance. We've got a quick wounded update from the Trump rally. I'm pleased to say that the 2 men who were seriously wounded, in addition to the murder of Corey Comparatori, have recovered enough to leave the hospital. Generous donations to a GoFundMe for the 3 men and their families has reached $6 million. Former Kentucky Attorney General warns about threats to business from woke corporations. As we watch the mass migration of businesses from California and the Northeast, I believe that business leaders are paying attention to each state's approach to business. Remember, it is not just the business itself, it's their employees, vendors, and investors. Another reminder comes from former Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron. He recently spoke with the Daily Signal, where he expressed concern that many publicly traded companies are no longer focusing on return on investments to shareholders. He is quoted, "We don't need companies built on diversity, equity, inclusion. We need companies built on excellence, merit, and intelligence." Hey, sounds like good advice to me. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is trying to crack down on so-called whistleblowers who are exposing gender medicine. And what we're seeing here with HHS is they're going after a whistleblower doctor named Ethan Schein, who exposed the fact that Texas Children's Hospital in Houston was still providing to minors gender change medical services, despite the fact that this violates Texas state law. The HHS is claiming that Dr. Schein violated the federal HIPAA privacy law. However, he stated in reply, it was his moral responsibility to expose what was happening to these children. Note that medical research would grind to a halt if the HHS interpretation of HIPAA is used. HIPAA prohibits the disclosure of PPI, patient's personally identifiable information. Other data is allowed. So as long as the names and identity of the children here were not disclosed, this does not violate HIPAA based on my own understanding of the facts here and the law itself. My audience knows that I do not oppose gender reassignment procedures, only that they should not be performed on minors. Minors are still developing how they feel about life, what's happening, and I think if they get through puberty and all that, and they still want to do a gender reassignment, that they should be allowed to do it as an adult under normal rules, which should include psychological counseling. A 134-year-old American furniture chain is closing down all 553 stores. Now, that's the headline, but there's a little discrepancy about what's really happening. Conn's Furniture, which is based in Texas, has been struggling like many American retail businesses. The competition is intense and the cost of doing business is high. Originally, Conn's announced they would go Chapter 11 bankruptcy and close non-performing stores. Sadly, the later announcement was that they were entering Chapter 11, but closing all of their stores since they've been unable to obtain interim financing. I note that part of the issue is covering the cost of a recent acquisition. This continues to be a pattern with a number of these companies that were doing okay. They then acquire a business and they're getting hit by these high interest rates that we're all facing, and they're unable to service the debt on the acquisitions. So I'm not exactly sure what's happening. I've seen other reports that say Conn's will only close 71 stores. But if you don't have the money to keep buying inventory and keep things rolling, I'm not sure how they would continue to do that. And remember, Chapter 11 is known as the business reorganization part of our U.S. bankruptcy code, and it's designed to provide shelter to a business while it gets its act together and moves forward with future financing. However, there's also something called a liquidating Chapter 11, the idea being that the business can get a better price and perhaps give a few dollars to its shareholders if it liquidates in a orderly manner. So we're still going to have to wait to see what happens there. This is Dr. David D. Schein. Thanks for joining us for this special episode of Saving America Weekly Review. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favorite platform.